There are people in your life you desperately want to help. You see their suffering, recognize their potential, feel called to support them. And every instinct you have says helping them is the compassionate, mature, spiritual thing to do. Carl Jung would say, helping them will destroy you both. Not because compassion is wrong, but because certain people cannot receive help in ways that actually help. Instead, your help enables their unconsciousness, prevents their development, and drains your psychological resources until you have nothing left. Jung discovered through decades of work that there are 5 specific types of people who are psychologically dangerous to help, not because they're bad people, but because the dynamic that emerges when you help them is toxic for them and for you. Your help doesn't heal them. It traps them in patterns that keep them sick, and it traps you in dynamics that prevent your individuation. I'm about to reveal the types of people Jung said you must not help. If you're currently trying to help someone and it's destroying you, this might explain why and give you permission to stop. Here's what Jung understood about helping. It's not always helpful. In fact, certain kinds of helping are profoundly harmful because they prevent the psychological work the other person needs to do. When you help someone who should be helping themselves, you're not being compassionate, you're being enabling. And enabling keeps people sick. The psychology is clear. Individuation requires that each person takes responsibility for their own development. When you take responsibility for someone else's development, you prevent them from developing. You're doing their psychological work for them, which means they never learn to do it themselves. But it's worse than that. When you help certain people, you don't just prevent their growth. You get trapped in a psychological dynamic that prevents your growth too. Your identity becomes organized around being the helper. Your self-worth becomes dependent on being needed. Your life becomes about managing their dysfunction instead of developing your consciousness. Jung saw this pattern constantly. Good people with compassionate hearts getting trapped in toxic helping dynamics. They'd sacrifice their own development to help someone who wasn't actually being helped. They'd drain themselves, trying to save someone who was using their help to avoid saving themselves. Here's the hard truth Jung discovered. Some people cannot be helped by you, not because they're beyond help, but because your helping prevents the crisis they need to experience to take responsibility for themselves. Your compassion is their enablement. Your support is their crutch. The first type Jung warned against helping. The person who's perpetually a victim but refuses to take any responsibility for their situation. They want your sympathy, your solutions, your resources, but they don't want to do anything differently themselves. Here's the psychological pattern. This person has organized their entire identity around being a victim. Life happens to them. Other people cause their problems. Circumstances prevent their success. They're always at the mercy of external forces. And they've become unconsciously invested in maintaining this victim position because it protects them from the terrifying responsibility of being the author of their own life. When you try to help this person, a predictable dynamic emerges. They'll take your help, experience temporary relief, then create another crisis that requires more help. Nothing you do creates lasting change because they're not using your help to develop. They're using it to maintain their victim identity. Jung saw this constantly. A patient would describe their terrible circumstances, all caused by others, all beyond their control. Jung would offer insight, suggest action, provide support. The patient would nod, agree, promise to try. Then return with new problems, more reasons they couldn't act, more evidence that life was victimizing them. Nothing changed because change would require them to stop being a victim, and being a victim had become their identity. But here's where this becomes dangerous for you. When you help a professional victim, you become part of their system. You become another external force they can blame when your help doesn't work. Or worse, you become the rescuer they depend on, which makes you responsible for maintaining them. The victim who refuses responsibility is a psychological black hole. No amount of help is ever enough because they're not using help to develop self-sufficiency. They're using it to prove they need help. Your compassion becomes their enabling. Your support becomes their excuse. Jung's advice: you cannot help someone who refuses to take responsibility for themselves. Every attempt to help them prevents the crisis that might force them to take responsibility. The most compassionate thing you can do is stop helping, stop rescuing, stop solving, stop providing. Let them experience the full consequences of their choices. That's not cruelty. That's respect for their capacity to grow. But the victim who refuses responsibility is at least conscious of wanting help. The next type is more insidious because they're draining you while denying they need anything. Jung's second warning: beware the person who constantly needs your emotional energy but never reciprocates and never changes. They're not asking for help directly. They're feeding on your attention, your concern, your psychological resources, and they're unconsciously organized around keeping you engaged in their drama. Here's the mechanism. This person always has a crisis, always has drama, always has something that requires your attention. Not necessarily your action or your solutions, just your energy. They need you to listen to their problems, feel concerned about their situation, stay emotionally invested in their outcome. Your attention is what they're feeding on, not your help. The dynamic is subtle because they're not explicitly asking for anything. They're just sharing, updating you on their endless problems, describing their latest drama, and you being a caring person. Give your attention, your emotional energy, your concern, which is exactly what they need to feel alive. Jung recognized this as a form of psychological vampirism. These people are energetically feeding on others because they can't generate their own psychological vitality. Instead of developing their own connection to the self, they're constantly seeking external attention to feel real. But here's what makes this dangerous. They're unconsciously skilled at keeping you hooked. The moment you start to withdraw, there's a new crisis, a new drama that pulls you back in. They're not consciously manipulating you. Their psyche has just learned that crisis generates the attention they need. And here's where this becomes dangerous for you. Engaging with an energy vampire doesn't just drain you, it prevents your individuation. Your psychological resources get directed toward their endless drama instead of your own development. Your life becomes about managing their emotional needs instead of exploring your depths. The energy vampire creates a one-way relationship where all energy flows toward them and nothing comes back. You give attention, concern, emotional labor. They take it, temporarily feel better, then need more. There's no reciprocity because reciprocity would require them to develop their own psychological resources. Jung's advice: you cannot help an energy vampire by giving them more energy. Every engagement reinforces their pattern of seeking external vitality instead of developing internal resources. The most helpful thing you can do is stop feeding them. Stop giving your attention to their drama. Stop getting emotionally invested in their crises. They'll either find another source or finally be forced to develop their own connection to vitality. But at least energy vampires are somewhat passive. The next type actively wants you to take on something that belongs to them. Jung's third warning is about projection dynamics. Beware the person who unconsciously wants you to carry their disowned shadow material. They're not asking you to help them integrate their darkness. They're asking you to become their darkness so they can remain light. Here's how this works. This person has rejected aspects of themselves they can't accept. Their anger, their selfishness, their darkness, their power. Instead of integrating these qualities, they project them onto others, and they unconsciously seek out people willing to carry these projections for them. When you try to help this person, you get cast into their shadow drama. If they've projected their anger, you become the angry one whenever you express any frustration. If they've projected their selfishness, you become the selfish one whenever you set boundaries. You can't help them because they're using you as a repository for everything they can't acknowledge in themselves. Jung experienced this in his practice. Patients would project their shadow material onto him. He'd become the father they hated, the authority they resented. Not because he was actually these things, but because they needed someone to carry these aspects so they didn't have to acknowledge them in themselves. But here's where this becomes dangerous for you. When you accept someone's shadow projections, you start embodying them. You start playing the role they've cast you in. You become the angry one, the selfish one, not because that's who you are, but because their constant projection has infiltrated your self-perception. You're carrying their shadow at the cost of your own psychological integrity. The projection machine creates a dynamic where helping them means accepting false identity. You can't support them without being cast as their shadow container. And as long as you're carrying what they've disowned, they never have to integrate it themselves. Jung's advice: you cannot help someone who's using you to carry their shadow projections. Every time you accept their projection, you enable their shadow denial and compromise your own psychological integrity. The most helpful thing you can do is refuse the projection, name what's happening, and insist they own their shadow material. They'll likely respond by finding someone else to project onto, but that's their work, not yours. But projection machines at least want you involved in their drama. The next type is more insidious because they seem like they want help, but they're actually using your help to avoid the very thing that would actually help them. If you're recognizing these patterns, trying to help the victim who won't take responsibility, the energy vampire who drains you with constant drama, or the projection machine who makes you their shadow carrier, Jung would say you're learning a hard truth. Not everyone can be helped by you, and trying to help them is harming you both. Before we explore the final two dangerous types, check out our new guide, True Self-Discovery, with 24 practical reflection exercises designed to help you find your way within. Click below to get True Self-Discovery. Let's continue, because these next two types might be the most difficult to stop helping, and the most dangerous when you don't. Jung's fourth warning addresses a particularly subtle dynamic: the person who seems to want help, but is actually using your help to avoid doing their own psychological work. They're not consciously manipulating. They're unconsciously using your willingness to help as a way to remain unconscious. Here's the mechanism. This person has problems that require inner work, shadow integration, grief processing, pattern recognition, identity transformation, real psychological development. But that work is uncomfortable and scary, so they unconsciously seek helpers who will provide external solutions that let them bypass internal work. They'll take your advice, use your resources, accept your support, but nothing fundamentally changes because they're treating symptoms while avoiding causes. They want you to fix their external situation so they don't have to transform their internal psychology. Jung noticed this pattern especially with patients who shopped for therapists. They'd work with someone until that person started pushing toward real psychological work. Then they'd leave and find someone new. They weren't seeking healing. They were seeking help, that let them avoid healing. But here's where this becomes dangerous for you. When you help someone who's using help to avoid their work, you become complicit in their avoidance. You're providing the external solutions that let them bypass internal development. And when no progress happens, you feel like you're failing. You work harder, provide more help, all while missing that your help itself is the problem. This person needs crisis, not rescue. They need to run out of external solutions, so they're finally forced to do internal work. But your help prevents that crisis. It provides just enough relief that they can continue avoiding the real work. Jung's advice: you cannot help someone who's using help to avoid their own work. The more you help, the more you enable their avoidance. The most helpful thing you can do is stop helping. Stop providing solutions. Stop offering rescue. Let them run out of external options so they're forced to turn inward. That's not abandonment. That's respect for the fact that some work can only be done by the person who needs to do it. But all these types at least have problems they're aware of. The final type is perhaps the most dangerous because they don't seem to need help at all until you realize they need you to need them. Jung's final warning is about the most insidious dynamic: the person who seems to be helping you but is actually creating dependency because they need you to need them. They're not dangerous because they're taking from you. They're dangerous because they're giving in ways that create obligation and prevent your autonomy. Here's the psychology. This person has organized their identity and self-worth around being needed. They don't feel valuable unless someone depends on them. So they unconsciously create relationships where others become dependent through constant giving that comes with invisible strings attached. They're always there for you, always offering help, always providing support. But their help doesn't strengthen you, it weakens you, because their unconscious agenda isn't to help you become self-sufficient. It's to help you in ways that ensure you'll continue needing them. Jung recognized this as psychological enmeshment. The codependent helper isn't actually helping. They're creating a dynamic where your growth threatens their sense of self. They need you to stay somewhat broken, somewhat dependent, somewhat in need of their help. The dynamic is subtle because they're not obviously controlling. They're giving, supporting, caring. But notice what happens when you try to do things independently. They're hurt, they're worried, they're convinced you're not ready. Not because you actually aren't, but because your independence triggers their fear of not being needed. But here's where this becomes dangerous for you. When you're in relationship with a codependent helper, your individuation becomes a betrayal. Growing stronger means needing them less, which threatens their identity. You're unconsciously pressured to stay somewhat weak, somewhat dependent, or face the guilt and hurt that comes from threatening their purpose. This person makes you responsible for their psychological stability by organizing their identity around being your helper. Your growth destabilizes them. Your independence hurts them. You're trapped between individuation and maintaining the relationship. Jung's advice: you cannot accept help from someone who needs you to need them. Their help comes with invisible costs: the cost of your autonomy, your growth, your individuation. The most honest thing you can do is refuse help that creates dependency, even when it seems generous, because the most dangerous help is the kind that seems loving, but is actually binding. Let me bring these dangers together. Don't help the victim who refuses responsibility. Your help enables their victimhood. Don't help the energy vampire who feeds on your attention. You're providing the external vitality they need to generate internally. Don't help the projection machine who wants you to carry their shadow. Accepting their projections compromises your integrity. Don't help the unconscious person who uses help to avoid their work. Your solutions prevent the crisis they need. And don't accept help from the codependent who needs you to need them. Their help creates dependency that prevents your individuation. Jung would say, "These aren't people to hate or judge. They're people trapped in unconscious patterns. But you cannot help them out of those patterns by participating in the dynamic those patterns create. Every attempt to help them within the toxic dynamic just reinforces it. The most helpful thing, sometimes the only helpful thing, is to refuse to participate. This doesn't mean you stop caring. It means you care enough to not enable. You care enough to let them face consequences. You care enough to protect your own psychological integrity. You care enough to respect that their development is their responsibility, not yours. Real help strengthens autonomy. Toxic help creates dependency. Real help facilitates individuation. Toxic help prevents it. If your helping is creating these toxic patterns, you're not helping, you're enabling. And enabling isn't compassionate, it's cowardly. If you're trapped in one of these dangerous helping dynamics, exhausted from trying to help someone who never changes, drained by constant demands on your energy, cast as someone you're not through projection, watching your solutions fail repeatedly, or feeling guilty for wanting independence, Jung would tell you, you're not failing at helping. You're succeeding at recognizing when helping is harmful. Give yourself permission to stop, to withdraw your help from the victim who won't help themselves, to stop feeding the vampire with your attention, to refuse the projection, to let the avoider run out of external solutions, to decline help that creates dependency. This isn't cruelty, it's wisdom. It's respect for the fact that some people can only grow through experiencing the full consequences of their patterns. It's recognition that your development matters as much as theirs. It's understanding that real compassion sometimes looks like refusal, boundary, withdrawal. You cannot save everyone. Some people can only save themselves, and they'll never save themselves as long as you're preventing them from facing the crisis that would force them to. Your help isn't helping, and the most loving thing you can do is stop. Trust that. Act on it. And protect your psychological resources for relationships that are actually reciprocal, help that actually strengthens, and dynamics that support mutual individuation rather than mutual limitation. If you're learning to distinguish healthy helping from toxic enabling, if you're developing boundaries around who you help and how, subscribe to this channel. To dive even deeper into Jung's revolutionary psychology and what it means for your spiritual awakening, click the recommended video on your screen now.